Hi, welcome to the video. I'm assuming that you started learning JavaScript and right now you learned a few concepts and you want to put all those concepts which you learned to build a small project. If that is the case, then you clicked on the right video. Let's get right into it. So this is the project which we will be building. This is basically a simplified version of the Chrome extension called Momentum. So it has a simple clock that actually updates every single minute. It shows the weather which is being fetched from a third-party API. So if you don't know how to use the fetch API to make HTTP requests, you will be learning that in this video. And we also have to have a little inspirational code in this bottom, which is also being fetched from another third-party API. And also we have a simple task list wherein we can go and add task. We can edit the task as well. We can remove the task as well. And also the image which we see in the background will also be updated every 10 minutes. So if I go ahead and refresh the page, it will actually fetch me a new image. So for fetching new image every 10 minutes, we are using the Unsplash API. We'll also be using the local storage to store all these tasks. So every time when we close and reopen the page, all the tasks will also be persisted. So the main concepts which we will be learning in this video are DOM manipulation, how to save and retrieve data from local storage, how to make network requests to third-party APIs using the fetch method. So let's get started. I have opened a blank project with 3 different files in it. So an index.html file which has nothing other than an h1 tag, and also the style tag has very minimal styling, and also the JavaScript file which contains nothing. You can just go to the extensions tab and search for live server, and this is the one which you should be having. So after when you installed it, you can just right click on the index file and then you can just click open with live server. So this is the blank page which we got. So let's get started. So firstly, let's go ahead and build this clock and the text which we see in the center. We can remove the h1. We can put a simple div tag which has a class of bg, and inside the div tag we can create another div tag with and this will actually hold the content. This will actually hold the content of this clock and then this text. So we can put a h1 and then we can give a class of clock, and then we can create an h2 with the class of main text. Alright, so inside this we can just put a right now let me put the time as a static one, but when we implement the JavaScript we will be doing it dynamically. So now we can go ahead and start styling it. Just go inside the style.css and then we can start styling it. So for the background, I want the width to be 100%. I want the height to be 100 VH. I want the height of the container to take the entire height of the entire height of the page. Then we can go ahead and give display of flex, and then align items center. Align item centers will center align the item vertically. To align the items horizontally center, we can do justify content of center. So that should center the alignment. Now we can go ahead and add a background image. So background image. I actually downloaded a background image from Unsplash. Right now we'll be using it for the development time. But later in this video we'll be dynamically fetching the images from the Unsplash API, and we'll be using that to change the image every 10 minutes. So I'm just gonna copy this image right here. Alright, so now we can actually go ahead and use that image. So you can use the URL method, and within double quotes we can point it to that particular image. So now we have that particular image on the background, but it's not appropriately positioned. So let's actually go ahead and position it. So background position, I want it to be center, and I don't want the image to repeat at any given point. So I'm going to do background repeat of none, no repeat. All right, and then I want the background size to cover. So right now the image has been set appropriately such that it occupies the full width of the page. Okay, so now we can start styling the text in the center. You can just go ahead and grab the clock. we can give a font size of 150 pixels, and then we can do a font weight of 400. We can also do a color to a subtle white color, so fi. Then we can add a text shadow. Just go ahead and I'm just going to paste the text shadow. So this will add a subtle shadow near the edges of the text. So when we save that, so if I actually zoom in, you can actually see a very subtle shadow on the edges of the text. We can do the similar thing to the main text as well. So we can just reduce the size of the font from 150 to 50 pixels. Okay, now just to center align this text, we can just go to the clock, and then we can add text align off center. Okay, in fact we can add the text align to both of them. Okay, so right now we've set up the clock, but we want to change the time dynamically, right? So every minute it should update automatically. So let's go ahead and do that using JavaScript. So let's go to JavaScript, and let me actually go ahead and grab the clock. So document dot query selector. I want to grab an element which has an ID of clock. So that will actually go ahead and grab this clock element, and we also need the main text element as well. So let me actually go ahead and grab that. So I'm going to write a function called setup clock. So to get the time, I'm going to create a date object. From using this date object, we can just go ahead and get the time. So we need the hours. We can just do date object dot get hours, and to get the minutes, we can just call the get minutes method. Now we can combine that and display the time. So const time equals, I'm gonna write a template title string. So I'm gonna write hours and then colon and then the minutes. So in this string, the hours will be replaced right here, and then the minutes will be replaced right here. So it will look like 12 colon 55, something like that. So to display that, clock dot text content equivalent to time, and also we need to call this method. So setup clock. Okay, so right now the time has been updated to the appropriate time. So as you can see, the system time is 13:19. Right now it's 13:18 because it updated a few seconds before. If I refresh the page again, it will update to the latest time. So right now we ran the function only. Right now we are running the function to initially set up the clock, but we need to keep running this function every single minute, right? Like once a minute we should call this function automatically. So in order to do that, we can just use the set interval method. So we can do set interval. So set interval takes 2 arguments as the parameters. The first one is the actual function which we need to call, and in our case that is setup clock. So we need to call the setup clock function every single minute, right? So that means every 60 seconds we should call this method. So we can just type 1000 in the sense 1000 represents 1 second, and we need to call this, and we need 60 seconds. So I'm going to multiply it by 60. So for every 60 seconds I want to call this function. So now this will automatically update the time accordingly. Okay, so after setting up the clock, we need to calculate the main text dynamically, right? Based on the hourly timing, we have to change the text dynamically. So let's actually go ahead and do that. So I'm going to write a set of if else statements to calculate that. So if the hours is greater than or equivalent to 5 o'clock and the hours is less than 12, in that case we can go ahead and do set the text of the main. We can set the text of the main to good morning. Okay, actually let me type my name in a variable. So username, I'm gonna store the username in a variable. Okay, so the next condition will be if the hours is greater than or equivalent to 12. So I'm starting where I finished the previous condition. So if the hour is greater than or equivalent to 12 o'clock and the hours is less than 17, so 17 represents 5 in the evening. So in that case I'm gonna go ahead and do good afternoon. So we can just copy paste the condition again. So then now if the hours is greater than or equivalent to 17 and the hour is less than 20, in that case we can just go ahead and do good evening, else we can just type good night. Okay, so now we should be getting the clock as well as the text appropriately. Alright, so we forgot to do one small thing. So right now if you notice the time, it says 17:06. It doesn't say 06, right? If you see the original version of it, it says 06. Like if the minutes or hours, if it is less than 9, then it automatically attaches a 0 in front of it, right? So we forgot to do that in our own application, so that's why it's like this. To fix that, we can just simply go to the code. We can simply add an if condition right here. If the hours is less than 9, less than or equivalent to 9, then we can do hours equals, we can make it as a string literal, and then we can add a 0 in front of it, and then we can do the same for the minutes as well. And also since we are reassigning the values to the same variables, we have to convert these variables to use let. And importantly, we need to calculate the time after the if condition. So now if hours or minutes is less than 10, then it should automatically append a 0 in front of it. Okay, so let's continue working on the other things. Next we can work on the code which we see in the bottom of the page. So let's actually go to our code and write some HTML. So I'm gonna write a paragraph tag. I'm gonna give a class of code, and I'm gonna write some dummy text inside it. Okay, so I want this particular code to be in the center of the page, right? So let's go to the CSS, let's target that particular code, and I want to give a fixed position for this, right? So I want to give a fixed position for this particular tag, so I'm going to give a position of fixed, and I want to specify where this particular paragraph tag to be pushed. So I want it to be pushed from the bottom, but not the, I want it to be the end of the bottom, but it shouldn't be touching the bottom, right? So there should be some padding between the particular paragraph tag and then the bottom of the page. So in order to get that, I'm going to give from the bottom of 8 pixels. So I want the particular paragraph tag to be 8 pixels from the bottom. And in order to get it center aligned, I'm going to give left of 50%. So now if you actually save it, and also let me actually go ahead and add a color of white. Now if we save that, you can see that it actually appears, but the problem is it starts from the second half of the web page, and we don't want that. We want it to be absolutely centered, right? So in order to get that, we need to apply a small transformation. So transform, and then we want to make the transform in the x-axis. So in the x-axis, I wanted to do in a negative 50% way. So this will actually center the paragraph tag in a center way. Right now we can see the text is not centered, so let's actually go back and do text align of center. So that should align the text in a center way. So now we have to get the particular code from the third-party API in a dynamic way. All right. So every time when the user comes to the page, we have to get them we have to show them a new code. So let's go to the JavaScript and let's actually target that particular code. So code equals document dot query selector, and I want to target an element which has a class of code. Okay. So now let's actually write a function of get code. So inside this method, we have to make a HTTP request to the third-party API to get that particular code. So let's actually go ahead and explore that particular API. As you can see, they have mentioned this is the base URL which we should contact, and to get a random code, we can just hit this random route. So the URL which we should make an request should be, we can just take the base route, and this is the base URL, and we have to make a request to the random route. So /random. At the end, I'm gonna say /random. So this is the URL to which we should make request. So the way we make request in JavaScript is using the fetch method. So we can do fetch, and inside the fetch we can just type the URL. So the fetch method will make an HTTP request to this particular URL and give us back the response, and then we can grab the response just like we normally receive any return value from a function. So making a network request to a third-party API and getting a response from it, it takes some time. It doesn't happen instantaneously. So we have to tell our JavaScript function to wait until we get a response from that server. So to do that, all we have to do is add an await keyword in front of the fetch. And in order to use the await keyword inside a function, we have to make this function an asynchronous function. To do that, we can add the async keyword in front of it. So now our function will actually wait until we get a response from the particular network request. So right now if we save it and we call this particular function, when we go back to our browser, and then we can open up the network tab by right clicking and going to inspect. We can click this additional more tabs and click on the network tab. So if we refresh the page, we can see that there is a network request made to the particular URL api.codable.io/random. So if we click on that, we can see the response, and from the response we can see there is attribute called content, and inside that particular content we actually have that particular code. We have to access this particular object in our JavaScript code. So to get the data from that particular response, all we can do is just to call that JSON method. So res.json, and we should await this as well. So now if we go ahead and do a console log, we should be able to see that particular object. So this is the actual response which we got from the server, and we can use this content attribute to actually get that particular code. So we can do data.content, and we want this data.content to be in the paragraph tag, to be in that particular codes element, right? So we can do code.text content. We can set the text content to data.content. So now if we save that, we can actually see a new code have been added in the bottom of the screen. So every time when we refresh the page, we get a new code. And also every time when we refresh the page, for the first fraction of a second, we see the dummy content which we placed in the HTML tag. So we can actually remove that. We can actually remove this particular dummy content, and we can also remove the time and then the main text as well. So all of these will be dynamically generated from the JavaScript. So now every time when we refresh the page, we get a new code. And whenever we are making network requests, it's always a good practice to wrap the entire code inside a try catch block. So we can take all of the code and paste it inside a try block, and inside the catch block we can just simply print the error. This is just to make sure that in case if the network request fails, our code won't break. Okay, so let's continue with the next item. When we see the completed version of the project, we can see that we are actually fetching the weather from a third-party API. So let's actually start doing that. Let's create the HTML tags wherein we'll show the details of the weather. I'm going to create a div and I'm going to give it a class of weather container. And inside that particular div, I'm going to create an h3, and also I'm going to create an paragraph tag. For the h3, I'm going to give it a class of city, and for the paragraph tag, I'm going to give a class of weather. So just to pre-populate some dummy values, I'm just going to type some values right here. Now when we see that, we again see that but two values right in the bottom of the page. So let's go back and add some CSS to position them in the appropriate top right corner. Let's go to CSS and let's target that particular weather container. And I want to give a fixed position. And from the top I want it to be in 16 pixels, and from the right I want it to be 16 pixels. So now we have that particular weather right here. For all the text elements which is present inside this particular container, I want them to have a color of white, so I'm gonna give a color of white. And also I want them to be aligned right side, so text align of right. So that should give something like this. Now let's actually go and write some JavaScript to fetch some API. So inside the JavaScript, let me go ahead and write another function. So we're going to make a network request using the fetch method. So I want this function to be an async function. I'm going to name this as get weather. And I'm also going to create a try catch block. So now the API which we're going to use is called as Open Weather Map API. So you can just go to this particular URL, openweathermap.org, and you can just click sign up and then sign up for an account. After when you create an account, you can click on this profile drop down and then you can go to my API keys. So by default an API key will be generated for you. So if it's not there, then go ahead and create a new API key. You can just give an API name right here and then click generate. That will generate a new API key. So now we have to copy this API key. So copy this API key and then go back to the code. I'm going to store it right here. I'm going to store it in a variable. So weather API key. We will be needing this API key when we make a request to the API. To get the exact API URL which we should make request to, we can go to the API section. We can scroll down, and then right inside the API documentation section, we can see there is a section called current weather data. And if we click on that, we can see the URL which we should make a request to. I'm going to copy this URL. I'm going to paste it right here. So inside that, we have to replace the API key with our own API key. So I'm going to make this as a template literal, and I'm going to change it to the API key variable. And we're not going to pass the latitude and longitude information. We're simply going to pass the location name. So we can pass a q parameter. I'm going to go to the top of the file and create a new variable called city name, and I'm going to type my city name here, so make sure to type your city name. I'm going to use that variable name right here. So we're querying the particular weather information for this particular city, and we're also passing the API key. So now we can call the fetch method to this particular URL, and then we can await for the response. And then when we get the response, we again have to call the JSON method and also await for that. And when we console log the data, make sure to call the method at the end. So I forgot to add one more property to this particular URL, so which is called as unit. I'm going to type unit equivalent to metric. So if you're wondering where I'm getting this information, so if we go back to the documentation, you can see this above the like below the URL, there are some parameters which we can pass through that. We're not going to pass latitude or longitude. We are passing the app ID, and then we can see there is a optional parameter called units. So I want to set the units to metric. Feel free to change it if you want. So unit equal to metric. Actually it's units, right? It's units. Okay, so we can save that, and then we can go back to our website. We can just hit a refresh. We can actually see the console, which is being printed right here. And inside that there is a lot of parameters, but we only need the temperature as well as the description of that particular weather, whether it is cloudy or hot or rainy or whatever. So inside the main property, we can see that there is a temperature property, right? So we can grab that. So const data dot main dot temp, and also we need the description, right? To get the description, we can go inside the weather property. We can close this main. There is a weather property. We can open that. So weather property is an array, and that array contains one element, and inside the 0th element we can see there is a description. So this is the description which we need. So data dot weather, and weather is an array, and we want to access the first 0th element. So I'm going to give an array brackets of 0 dot description. Okay, so now we got the temperature as well as the description. Now we can insert it to our particular HTML elements. So we can go to the top, we can grab the weather element. So document dot query selector. I want to select the element which has a class of weather, and also I want to grab an element which has the class of city. So here I'm just setting the city name to the appropriate city HTML element. So our city will be displayed right here. So here I'm just setting the text of the city HTML element to the city name which we stored in our JavaScript. Then we can go ahead and grab the weather element, and then we can set the weather. So weather dot text content equivalent to. So here I want to have the temperature. So here I want to have the temperature first and then the description of that particular temperature. So I'm going to give the temperature, then the description. So now if you save that, we can see that the appropriate data has been displayed right here. But if you notice, there are decimal values, and we don't want the decimal value, right? So we can actually remove that. I'm going to make this temp as a let variable, and I'm going to change the temperature equivalent to math.flow of temp. So math.flow function removes the decimal part from the number, and also we should have a small c to represent the Celsius. So now if we save that, we can actually see it is 30 degrees Celsius. Since we completed the weather API implementation, now we can actually go ahead and implement the task. First we can work on the designing of this particular element, and then we can work on the functionality using JavaScript. I'm going to create another div. I'm going to give it a class of task container. Inside the task container, I'm going to create a form, and I'm going to give a class of task form, and inside the form I'm going to create an input. I'm going to give it a class of task input. I'm going to give a placeholder of add a task. I'm going to make it as required. We can see there is a small input tag in the bottom of the page. Now let's actually go ahead and start styling it. I'm going to target the task container. I'm going to give a fixed position. From the top, I want it to be 16 pixels. From the left, I want it to be 16 pixels as well. So now it will appear on the top left corner. Now we can go ahead and give it a padding of top and bottom of 2 pixels, and left and right I don't need any padding, so I'm just going to give 0 pixels. I'm going to give it a background color of fi, and fi, and then I'm going to give a border radius of 2 pixels. I'm going to set the width to 100%, but I'm going to set the maximum width to 400 pixels so that we get this kind of an effect. And I'm copy pasting a box shadow value. This will give a very subtle box shadow. Now we can start styling the task form. Task form, I'm just going to give a padding of top and bottom of 8 pixels and left and right of 12 pixels. Only want to add the border to the bottom, so 1 pixels solid. I want to give a gray color, but I don't want the gray color to be dark, so I'm just going to reduce the opacity a little bit. This is a subtle border. Now let's go ahead and style the task input. So I want it to take the full width. I want the font size to be 16 pixels, and I don't want any border, so border of none. I don't want any outline, so outline of none. So now you can see it's much better, but still we can see there is a background color, so let's actually remove that. So background color, I want it to be transparent, right? So now that looks much better. Now let's actually go ahead and design a task as well. So let's go back to the HTML, and inside that let me actually create a div and give it a class of task, and inside the task I'm gonna create a pre-tag. This is task. I also want to create a button, so button. So in our completed version we can see for a task, when we hover over it, there is a button and there is a minus sign inside it, right? So to get the minus sign, we can just type ampersand minus and then colon. So this will give the minus sign. As you can see, this gives the minus sign. Let's go back to CSS. Let's do target the task. I'm going to give a display of flex. I want to align items in the center way, and I want the paragraph element as well as the button element to be separated to the either sides. I'm going to give justify content of space between. So this should actually do that. Fine. Let's go ahead and add some padding. So padding of top and bottom of 8 pixels. Left and right we don't need any padding as of now. Fine, we'll figure that later. I'm going to target the paragraph element as well as the button element using the class name of task. So I want to style the paragraph element which is present inside the task element. I'm going to give flex of 1 such that it takes the maximum width of the container. I'm going to give padding left of 8 pixels and also padding right of 8 pixels. The same way we can target the button as well. I want to give fixed width and height for the button, so width is going to be 50 pixels, then height is also going to be 50 pixels. I want the color of the button to be a red color, so I'm just going to give it as crimson. I want the background color to be a very subtle red color, so I'm going to select crimson, but I'm going to reduce the opacity to 30%, and I want the button to be in a rounded way, so I'm going to give a border radius of 50% and a little bit margin on the on the right hand side. So margin right 8 pixels. Okay, so the button size is very huge. I should reduce it. So instead of the width and height being 50 pixels, I'm going to give it as 24 pixels each. Okay, so that is much better. And we need to remove the border and the outline. So let's remove that. Border, none. Outline of none. And I want the cursor to be pointer. So there you go. That looks much better. And we can increase the font weight a little bit. So font weight of 700. So font weight of 700. Okay, that's much better. Okay, so now I don't want to show the button by default. I only want to show the button when I hover over the task element. So to achieve that, I'm going to give an opacity of 0 on the task element. So by default, it's not going to be visible. We can target the task, and while we are hovering over the task, I'm going to target the button which is inside it, and then I'm going to give the opacity of 1 to the button. So this gives the opacity to the button, not to the task. Alright. So if you save that, now when I hover over the task, you can see that the button actually appears. This is exactly what we wanted. And also I want the cursor to be pointer all throughout the task. So I'm just going to go to the task, and I'm going to give a cursor pointer. Alright. So now whenever I hover over the task, it's going to give me a pointer kind of a cursor. And also when I hover over the task, I want to change the background of the task. So when I hover over the task, I want the background color to be an off gray. So I'm going to choose gray. I'm going to reduce the opacity to a very low number, to 0.2277. So when I hover over it, you can actually see the background, and even this background is really a little bit harsh. I'm going to reduce that to even more. 0.1 should be perfect. There you go. That looks much better. And just a small correction, I'm going to remove the padding from the task, and then I'm going to give the padding to the paragraph tag. So I'm just going to give padding of 8 pixels overall. That should look exactly the same. And also we must create a completed state of a task. So just to show that, if we have a task and then we completed it, we reduce the opacity of the text as well as we give a strike through the text, right? So we should do that as well. Let's go back. So if the paragraph tag which is inside the task has a class of completed, then I want to reduce the opacity to 0.75, and then I wanna give a text decoration of a line through. Alright, so to check that, I'm just gonna go and create and copy paste a new task, and then I'm gonna add a class of completer to the paragraph tag. So that should give me this strike down kind of a look, right? We can actually reduce the opacity a little bit more, so we can reduce the opacity from 0.75 to 0.5. So that looks much better. Fine. Now we can go ahead and start typing some JavaScript code to actually add the functionality of adding the task and removing the task. Let's go to the script and let's target the particular elements which we need. We'll be needing the task container, so I'm going to get the task container. So document.query selector task container. We'll also be needing the task input, so task input. We'll be needing the task form as well, so task form. So whenever we type something in the form, task form, and then we hit enter, you can see it actually refreshes the page, right? So the default behavior of an HTML form is to send the form data to some remote server, but we don't have any server right now, so we're just going to prevent the default behavior and then stop the page from refreshing. To do that, I'm gonna create a listener for submit event on the task form. So I'm just gonna go all the way down, and in the task form I'm gonna add an event listener for an event called submit. So this submit event will be triggered whenever the user types something in the task input and then hits enter. So whenever the user hits enter, this submit event will be triggered. So the second parameter of the add event listener method is to be a function. So I'm gonna give a function name. So a handle task submission, and I'm gonna create this function right above here. Since this is an event handler function, whenever the browser sees that we are submitting the form, it's going to trigger this particular function, and then it's going to pass the event as an object. So we're going to receive the event as an object in the function, and using the event we can actually call a method called prevent default. We can call the prevent default method to actually stop the browser from refreshing. So now if we go ahead and type something and hit enter, the page won't refresh. This is exactly what we wanted. So now we know that the page won't refresh. Now we need to grab the text which is being present in the particular input, right? So to grab the text, so I'm just going to type text, const text equals task input. We're going to reference the input element and we want the value of that particular element. So we want the value. And also I'm just going to add a small if condition right here just to check that whether the text is not empty. So if the text is empty, I simply want to return from the function. I don't want to do anything else. Now we can actually go ahead and create a new task. So const task equals, I'm going to create a new JavaScript object, and inside the JavaScript object I'm going to have the task. I'm going to map it to the text which we got from the form input, and also I'm going to add a completed property which represents whether the particular task is completed or not. By default the value of the completed is going to be false. And also importantly, for each of the tasks, just to identify each of the tasks uniquely, we need to have an ID for that particular task. So how do we generate an ID in the browser? So the easiest way to generate an ID is basically to use the crypto module. Just to show that, I'm going to print a console. So crypto dot random UUID. Random UUID is a method. Whenever we call the method, it's going to return a new unique identification ID. So if we inspect the page and open up the console, so whenever I type something and I submit the form, you can see that it generates a unique ID. We can use this particular IDs as the ID for the task which we are about to create. So in the task object, we can add an ID prop, and then we can create an ID using the crypto module. Each of the tasks will have an ID, the appropriate task text, and also the completed. By default, the completed value is set to false. We want to make sure that we store it in our application, right? So I'm going to create a new array. I'm just going to go ahead and create a new tasks array. By default, it's going to be an empty task. And I'm going to add this particular task object into that array. So tasks dot push this particular task. Okay, so after when we push the task, we also want to create this particular task on the screen, right? We want to create these elements dynamically using JavaScript, and then we want to insert those elements into the web page. So the way we do that is I'm going to create another function. So I'm going to call this as create task, and this will take task as a parameter, and we'll be calling this method right here. So create task, we're going to add the new task. So we're going to call the create task method by passing in the new task which we are about to create. So now when we see the actual HTML elements of a particular task, we can see there is a div, and inside the div we have a paragraph tag, we have a button as well. So we need to create three different elements: a div, a paragraph tag, as well as a button. So let's do that. So const div, I'm gonna do document dot create element. I want to create a div element, The same way, I want to create a paragraph element as well. The same way, I need a button element as well. Alright, and for the div, I need to add a class of task. So I'm gonna go to the class list property, and in the class list property there is a method called add. I'm gonna add a class called task. So this task class will be automatically appended right here. Alright, so in the paragraph tag, I need to actually set the content of the task, right? So I'm going to do paragraph dot text content equivalent to task dot text, right? Task. Okay, actually I've named it as task. I'm going to rename it to title. So each task will have an ID, task, and then completed, and we want to set the title to the paragraph tag. So I'm going to change this from text to task title. Alright, so after that, I want to go ahead and add the content for the button as well. So for the button, I want to set the inner HTML. So inner HTML equivalent to the minus sign, right? So we just copy that, we can just paste it right here. Alright, so now we need to add the paragraph element as well as the button element to the div. So we can just target the div, and then we can do append, and then inside the append we can just pass the paragraph tag as well as the button tag. So now we need to add this div to the entire task container, right here. So we actually made a reference to the task container right in the top of our application, top of our code. So task container, we're going to use this, and then we're going to add that particular div inside it. So task container dot append that particular div. So after this, a new task will be created, and also inside the handle task submission, I want to reset the text of the input. So task input dot value equivalent to an empty string. Every time when a user submits a task, we take the task and then we create a task element, and then we add it to the DOM. After that, we're going to reset the input value of the task input to an empty string. Fine, let's actually try this and hope it works. So hello, so it works. There you go. So the elements have been added. Nice. Alright, so now we can do the other functionalities. Like whenever we click on an element, it actually so whenever we So now we can work on other functionalities, like whenever we click on the task, it actually completes the task, and whenever we click on the button, the minus button, it actually removes the task. So whenever we're creating a task, I'm going to go ahead and add an event listeners. So in the paragraph tag, so whenever we click the paragraph tag, so on click, I want to go ahead and call another function. So I'm going to create a function, so toggle task completion. Then we can create this function above right here. Since it's a click event, we can receive the event right here. And also, if you're confused this way of adding a function to the onClick, this is very similar to doing it this way. So p.add event listener, and then we're gonna listen for the click event, and then we're gonna call the task toggle task completion function. So these two statements are exactly the same. Actually, we can use this for the button example. So whenever we click on the button, we need to run a function called remove task. So, and I'm also going to create a function called remove task right here. Now let's actually focus on the paragraph tag. So whenever we click on the paragraph tag of the task, we want to toggle the completion of the task. So we want to run this function, and I'm actually going to print the event just to show what is in the event attribute. Let's go back to the browser. Let's open up the console. Let's clear the console. Let's actually delete these elements from the HTML DOM. Let's go there and let's actually comment this. Fine. Now when we come back, it should be empty. Now if we add a task, now when I click on the task, see there is an event. This event is being printed right here, right? So whenever we we configure in such a way that whenever we click on the paragraph tag, we're going to run a function, and inside the function we're going to print the event object. And inside this event object, when you see, there is an element called target. So this target is basically this paragraph tag. So event is basically the event which is being generated. So right now it's the onClick event. The target attribute is pointing to the HTML element from which the event has been triggered. So in our case, the paragraph tag is the target, right? So even when I hover over the p tag, it actually shows the thing in the browser. All right, and we also need the target, so we're gonna get the target. So the target is actually a paragraph element, so I'm just gonna name it as p. So event dot target, and in this paragraph tag, we want to add a class name, right? So p dot class list dot add, I'm going to add a name called completed. So previously, while we were styling the task element, we wrote some CSS to make sure that if the paragraph element inside the task has a class of completed, we're going to reduce the opacity and we're going to show a line through, right? So this is actually what we're doing right here. So whenever we click on the paragraph tag, we're going to add a class of completed. So now if I add a task and then if I click on it, it actually adds the class of completed to that particular element. So right now, if I right click and inspect this particular element, you can see that there is a task completed being added. So now we have a completed task. So if we click on a completed task, it doesn't do anything, right? It runs the same function. It just adds the completed task again and it does nothing. So to avoid that, we want to toggle the class, right? So if there is a completed task, we wanna remove the completed task, and if there is no completed task on that particular paragraph element, then we want to add that. So to achieve this functionality, there is a method called toggle in the class list attribute. So we can use the toggle method instead of the add method. We are using the toggle method. So now if we add a task, if we click on it for the first time, it actually adds the completed class, and then it appears as a completed task. If I click on that again, it actually removes the completed class from the paragraph tag. So this is possible because of the toggle function. So every time when we are toggling the state of the particular task, we should also make sure that we are updating the task which is present in the task array. So as you remember, every time when we are creating a task, we are adding the task to that particular array. So every time when we are updating it, we should also update in the task array as well. So how do we find the particular task from the task array? So as you recall, we added an ID to each of the tasks, right? So we can use this ID to figure out which particular task that we're trying to update. So whenever we're creating a task, we can add the task ID as the paragraph ID as well as the button ID of the task element. So inside the create task method, we can copy the task ID into the paragraph ID. So p.id equals task.id. So the ID of that particular task will be copied in the will be made as the ID for the paragraph tag as well, and we can do the same thing for the button as well. Now if we go ahead and add a task, and then if we inspect the particular element, we can see the paragraph tag has an ID of the task. This same ID will be present in the task object which is present in the task array in our JavaScript. So whenever we are updating a task, we can take the ID from this particular paragraph tag and compare it to the task objects which are present in the task array. So let's actually go ahead and do that. Let's actually minimize these functions as well. Alright. So inside the toggle function, to get the ID from the particular paragraph tag, we can just do const ID equals p.id. So now whenever we toggle a task, we can actually get the ID of that particular task. Let me also print the tasks as well. Alright, so now if we go ahead and add some tasks, So now whenever we click on the task to update it, we can see we get the ID from the paragraph tag, and when we see the task array, we can see there is a task object with the same particular ID, right? We just have to take the particular ID from the paragraph tag and compare it to the elements in the task array, and then get this appropriate task element and update the completed property. So to update the task object in the task array, either we can run a for loop or we can use the map method of that array. So I'm just going to use the map method. So I'm going to type task.map. So the map method takes a function as an argument, and that function receives the array object as a parameter. So in our case, the array object is the task. The map method executes this function with each of the array elements individually. It also collects the returned value from the function. So inside the function, we can write an if condition. If the current task dot id, if that particular id is equivalent to the id which we got from the paragraph tag, then we know that we have to update the completed property of that particular task. So we can do task.completed equivalent to negation of task.completed. So this will toggle the boolean value of the completed attribute. After the if condition, we can actually return the task. So the map method executes this function with each of the tasks as a parameter, and it collects the returned value and creates a new array with it. And the new array will be returned by the map method, so we can receive it and save it in the task object. So now every time when we complete a task, we are not only updating the UI, but we are also updating the task array in our JavaScript. So now in a similar way, we can delete the task as well. So as you remember, we attached the event listener to the button. So every time when we click on the remove button, we actually call the remove task. Inside the remove task, we can get the ID of the task which is supposed to be removed from getting the ID of the button. So event.target.id will hold the ID of the task which needs to be removed. So to remove an element from an array, we can use the filter method of that array. So task.filter. So the filter method takes a function as a parameter, and this function will be executed for each of the array elements by passing them as a parameter. And from this filter method, we should return a boolean value such that if we return true, that particular element will be retained in that array. If we return false, that particular element will be removed from that array. So we can write a condition like task.id not equivalent to id. So here we are checking if the current task id is not equal to the id which we got from the button tag. In that case, we can keep this task. If not, we can remove this task from that array. And this filter method does not mutate the array, it actually creates a new array and then it returns it. So now every time when we click the remove button of a task, we are actually removing the task from the task array, but we should also make sure that we are removing the task element from the DOM. So to do that, let's actually visualize the task element. So if we inspect the task element, we can see that the task has a paragraph tag as well as the button, and when the user clicks on the button, we not only want to remove this button, we want to remove the entire task element as well, right? We want to remove this entire div which contains the paragraph tag as well as the button. So we need to get the parent of the button and then remove that element. So to get the parent of that element, you can simply do event.target.parent element, and then we can call parent.remove. If we click on the remove button, it actually removes the element from the DOM. And we also notice that whenever the task list is empty, we're not showing like no tasks are found. So in our initial demo, we have something like whenever the task array is empty, we are showing that you don't have any tasks. So we forgot to add this particular part. So let's quickly add that. Let's go back to the index.html, and inside the task container, let's add a small paragraph tag, and let's give it a class of no task found. So we can quickly style this as well. Let's go to CSS and let's give it some style. We can give a padding of 8 pixel. We can give a font size of 14 pixel. We can do text line of center. So now we can see you don't have any tasks. But the thing is, we don't want to show this all the time. We only want to show this when there are no tasks available, right? So I'm going to go back to the style, and by default I'm going to give display of none. So by default we don't see it, and whenever there is no object in the task array, that's when we show that. So in the JavaScript we can actually reference that element. So we can go to the top, we can grab that no task element, and we only want to show this no task element when there is no task. So whenever we are removing a task, after removing a task, we just have to check if the task array dot length, if that is equal to 0, that means we don't have any task in that queue, right? So at that point we can reference the no task element, we can call the style property, and then we can set the display value to block. So now if we add a task, and then if we remove that, after removing the last task, we see that element. But also whenever we add a new task, we should again remove this no task found element from the DOM. So after when we create and push the task to the DOM, we should also make sure that we are hiding the no task element. So no task element dot style dot display equal to none. So now we can add an element. Now if we remove the last element, we see the no task element found, as well as if we start adding a new task, it actually disappears. So that's the exact behavior we want. So right now we have our entire task list ready. So we can add a task, we can complete a task, we can remove a task as well. But whenever we refresh the page, our entire task list disappears, right? We're not storing the data anywhere. So we need to find a small solution wherein we persist the data even when the user closes and revisits the page after some time. So the easiest solution for this is to use the browser's local storage. So local storage is this simple storage system which is provided by the browser, wherein websites can go and store some data. So in order to save the task to the local storage, we have to write some JavaScript code. So let's go ahead and do that. So anytime when we submit and create a task, after creating a task, we should store the task to the local storage. So the way we do that is by doing local storage dot set item, and the set item takes two parameters as an argument. The first one is the key and second one is the value. So I'm going to give a key of tasks, and the second one is the actual value. So I'm going to give a task array. So the important point about local storage is local storage can only store string values. It cannot store JavaScript objects. So in order to save our task array to the local storage, we need to convert our task array to a string. So the way we do that is using the json.stringify method. So json.stringify of our tasks. So json.stringify will convert our task array to a string representation of that, and that string will be stored in a key of tasks. If we save that and go back to the browser, and when we add a task, to actually see the data which is stored in the browser, we can go to the inspect tab, we can go to the application, and inside the application we can select local storage, and in the local storage we can see the actual data which we stored from our JavaScript. So we can see there is a key called tasks, and for that particular key we have a value, and the value is actually the string representation of our array. So now we have to make sure that every time when we update or delete a task, we are also saving that to the local storage. So let's go back. We can just copy this, and since we will be using this thing again and again, I'm just going to create a function out of it. So I'm just going to go to the top. I'm going to create a new function called save local storage. This will take two arguments. One is the key, another one is the value. So here we can do local storage dot set item of key, and we can do json dot stringify of the value part. So now we can use this function whenever we want to save things to local storage. So we can go down, and here we can replace it with the function which we created. Tasks, and then we have to save the tasks array, and we don't need this. We can do the same thing whenever we are updating a task and deleting a task. So inside the toggle function, we can just come here and then we can save the task. We can do the same thing inside the remove task function as well. So now anytime we update a task or when we delete a task, it's also going to be reflected in the local storage. So I'm just going to clear everything, and if we add a task, and when we click on and when we update a task, we can actually click on this and see the object. So we can see the second object has a completed of true, but the first object doesn't have that. So even if we remove an item, we can see whenever we remove a task, the data is also getting updated in the local storage. This is exactly what we wanted. But the problem is whenever we refresh the page, we're not seeing the task right here, right? When we see the local storage, we are having the task which we previously had, but whenever we revisit the page, we're not getting the data from the local storage and actually getting the task in the DOM. So to do that, we can go all the way down. So right here, we can retrieve the data from the local storage. So to do that, we can do local storage dot get item, and we want to get the item by passing the key. So the key we set was tasks, right? So we can do tasks, and this retrieve task can also be undefined or null, because let's say when a user visits this web page for the first time, he or she won't be having any task in the local storage. So at that time, this retrieve task will be undefined. So just to make sure that we are having actually some value, we can do if retrieve tasks. So if there is a retrieve task, we can actually go ahead and start using it. Right now, if you remember, whenever we saved our task to the local storage, we actually converted the JavaScript array to the string. So whenever we retrieve it, we have to do the vice versa of it. We have to convert the string to a JavaScript array. So the way we can do that is by using the parse method. So we can do json.parse of retrieve task. This will convert the string representation of an array to an actual JavaScript array, and then we can store it to our tasks array. Since we wrote an utility function to save some data to the local storage, we can do the similar thing of writing a utility function to get things from local storage. So in the same way as saving to the local storage function, we can write a get local storage function. So function local storage, and we need the key. Here we can do local storage dot get item of that particular key. And we know that whenever we retrieve some data from local storage, we actually have to check if that particular data actually exists or it is undefined. So let's write an if condition. So if there is data, then I want to go ahead and return the parsed version of it. So I'm going to do json.parse of data. And if there is no data, I just simply want to return null. So now we can use this function wherever we want in the application. So instead of doing all this, you can simply do get local storage of task, and if there is a retrieve task, so we don't have to do json.parse here. If we have a retrieve task, we can go over and loop over the retrieve task array and start creating task elements and adding it to the DOM. So we can do retrieve task dot for each, and we can take each of the task as a parameter, and for each of the task we're going to call the create task function. So if you remember, we have a function for creating a task, right? Create task. We're going to call this function by passing the task object. So here we're going to call the create task function by passing task as an object. So now if we go back and refresh the page, we can actually see the task which is stored in the local storage have been retrieved, and appropriately the tasks have been rendered in the HTML DOM as well. And also, whenever we are creating the task, we should make sure that if the task has a property of completed set to true, then we actually go ahead and add the completed class to the paragraph tag. So let's write an if condition. So if the task that completed is true, then on the paragraph tag we're going to add a class list of completed. So we forgot to do one important thing. which is, so after when we retrieve the task from the local storage, we have to copy that to the local tasks array which we have in our program. So we can do tasks equals retrieve tasks. And also, whenever we visit the page for the first time, and if we don't have anything in our task queue, we don't see the no task element found. So just to show that, we can add that in this else statement. So else, if we don't have any retrieve task from the local storage, we can just display the no element found. So we can just copy this, paste it right here, and then we can set the display to block. So now if we refresh the page, still we don't see that no task found element. Actually, we can see the task array is an empty array. So an empty array object, when passed to an if condition, it actually returns true. So this if condition becomes true and this executes, so it doesn't go to the else statement. So inside this if condition, we can add another condition like if the retrieved task dot length, if the length is greater than 0. So now if we go back, we can actually see that no tasks have been found. So now our entire task system is completed. Now we can focus on the background wallpaper. Right now we've added a static image as a background of our application, and we want to be able to change the image dynamically every time when the user comes to the page. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to use a third-party API to achieve this. So we're going to use the Unsplash API to get free images. Go to unsplash.com and sign up for an account. After signing up, click on the menu, and inside the menu you can see there is a tab called developer/API. So click on that. Inside that you can click on your apps, and you can see there is like 3 different apps which I've already created, and let's go ahead and create a new application. And you can just tick all these requirements and then click accept terms. You can just give it a name. So I'm just going to give it as JS dashboard, and then click create application. So after creating an application, we can just scroll down on the same page, and then we can see there are 2 different keys, access key and secret key, and we would be needing this access key. So every time when we make a request from our application to the Unsplash API, we should be sending this access key as a parameter in the request. I'm going to copy this. I'm going to go back to the code. I'm going to create another variable. So const Unsplash API key equals, and then I'm going to paste that key right here. Alright. So now we need to write a function to make an API request. So I'm just going to scroll down. So we have the weather function, the function which we wrote to get weather dynamically from an API. So I'm just going to copy this, and we're going to duplicate this. So I'm going to paste it right here. Let me collapse this, and I'm going to change this name to get image. So inside here I'm going to change the URL. So I have the URL right here. I'm just going to copy this and go back to the code. I'm going to paste it right here, and here in this URL we can see the orientation of that particular image which we're trying to get is set to landscape, as well as the amount of image which we want is set to 1, and as well as the client ID. Client ID is basically the secret ID, our API key, so that is set to the Unsplash API key variable, and as well as query. So query, we can just create a variable. We can create a query, and we can query for wallpapers. Alright, so now we can remove all these. In the console we can print the data and see what's coming back. And also we need to call this method. So I'm gonna go all the way down, and I'm gonna call this method. Alright, so now if we save that and when we go back to our site, so now as we can see in the console there is an object called image, and when we open that, and we only have one item in that array because we only queried for one image. So as you remember, we set the count equals 1 right when we made the request. So if we see the 0th object, we can see that there is like quite some parameters right here, but the one which we are interested is the URLs. So I'm just going to open the URLs, and then we can see there is like few different URLs. So each one of them represents the few different sizes, and inside the URL object we can see all the links of that image. So if I copy this link and then if I paste it in a new tab, make sure to remove the double quotes which is present in the front and the end. So remove the double quotes in the front as well as in the end, and then if we press enter, we can actually see the image which we got from that API. So right now we have a few different options. Either we can use the full image or raw image or this regular image. We don't want to use the small or the thumbnail image. I'm going to go with the regular, but feel free to change it. So I'm going to copy regular. So here from the data, we need the image URL. Since data it's an array and we want to access the first object, I'm going to point to the 0th element, and then we want to access the URLs attribute, and from the URLs attribute we need the regular one. So now we have the image URL, and all we have to do is to set this image URL as our background. So if we go back to our HTML, we know that we are setting that image in this particular div, right? BG div. So I'm going to make a reference to this in our JavaScript. So I'm going to go all the way to the top. Now we can set the background property of this particular element. So bd dot style dot background image equals image URL. So actually we need to set the image URL with using that URL method of the CSS. So like this. So I'm just going to copy this. I'm going to make this as a string literal. I'm going to paste it right here, and inside right here we want to replace it with that image URL which we got. So just like this. So now if we save it and go back to the browser, we can see we got a new image. So every time when we refresh the page, we're going to get a new image. So if I refresh the page, as you can see, we got a new image. But if you notice, we had that previous background which was appearing for a fraction of a second. So in order to remove that, we can go back to the CSS and then we can hide it. And then we can just give a background color of slide gray. So I'm just going to go and give it a slide gray. Right now, if you refresh the page, we can see that we don't see that default static background image which we saw earlier. So right now, every time when we refresh the page, we will get a new background. So now every single time when we refresh the page, or if we close and revisit the same page again, we're going to make a new HTTP request to the Unsplash API, and then we're going to be fetching a new image. And personally, I don't really like this way of doing it, so I don't want to see a new image every single time when I come to this page. And also, since we're using the free version of the Unsplash API, there is like a rate limit. So I'm going to write a small piece of code to make sure that we're only fetching a new image when it's been 10 minutes since the last time we fetched an image. The way we're going to do that is every time when we get an image, after setting that image to the background, I'm going to go ahead and save the image URL to the local storage. And we're going to use the save local storage method which we created earlier. So I'm going to pass a key of image URL, and then I'm going to save the image URL. And also I'm going to save another thing to local storage, which is the current time at which we fetched this particular image. I'm going to give it a key of time, and in the value part I'm going to create a new date object. So what this new date does is that it's going to return a date object for the current time. Just to show that, if I open up the console and then if I create a new date object, and then if I print that, as you can see, this date object represents the current date and time. So whenever we are getting an image, we're also going to save this particular time at which we fetched that image to the local storage. And that's exactly what we're doing right here. So now every time we fetch an image, we're going to save that image to the local storage, as well as that save the time at which we fetched that image. Alright, so now, so every time when we visit the page, we're going to retrieve that image URL as well as the time, and we're going to make sure that if the current time and then the time which we retrieve from the local storage has a time difference of 10 minutes. If the time difference is more than 10 minutes, in that case, we can go and fetch for a new background wallpaper and change it. We're going to retrieve the image URL which we previously saved in the local storage, and we're going to use that image as the background image. So to do that, I'm going to retrieve the image as well as the datetime object from the local storage. So if there is a previous time, So after retrieving the time from the local storage, this is going to be a string, and we have to convert the string to an actual datetime object. So the way we do that is this: we just pass the previous time to the date constructor. After that, we're going to get the current datetime object. So creating a new date object like this will always return the current system date and time. And after this, based on these two datetime objects, we have to calculate the time difference between the retrieved time and the current time and check if the difference is more than 10 minutes. So to do that, we're going to make use of the getTime method. So the getTime method returns the total number of milliseconds for this particular date since January 1st, 1970. So if we console log and check this particular value, we can see it returns a number. So this is the total number of milliseconds from Jan 1, 1970 till this current date and current time. So we're going to do the same thing for the current date as well as the retrieve date time. Alright. So now we have both the date objects in a milliseconds format. So now we can actually subtract these two and get the time difference. Since these two are in milliseconds, the difference is also going to be in milliseconds. So we have to convert the milliseconds to minutes. So to convert the milliseconds to seconds, I'm just dividing it by 1000, and this will return a decimal value. So I'm going to use the math.abs method. This math.abs method will exclude the decimal part. And now we can convert the seconds into minutes. So now we have the time difference of these two objects in a minutes format. So now we can check if the time difference in minutes is greater than 10. If the time difference is greater than 10, then we can go ahead and make another API call and fetch for a new background image. So I'm just going to call the getImage method. So that will initiate a new HTTP request, get an image and then set it as a background. If the time difference is less than 10 minutes, then we can use the previous image which we stored in our local storage. So we're going to use this image URL which we retrieved from local storage, and I'm going to set this as the background. So let me go up and copy this particular line, and then let me come back and then paste it right here. Let's say the user is visiting this page for the first time. In that case, there is not going to be any image URL in the local storage. There is not going to be any previous time which is going to be stored in the local storage. So in that case, if there is no previous time, then we're going to have to write an else condition. So we're going to write an else part, and then we're going to call the getImage method. So if there is no previous time or if there is no image URL, then we're going to automatically get a new image from the API. So after writing these conditions, we can actually remove the getImage call from the bottom. So I'm just going to comment this. We don't need that. So now if I save that and if we go back to the web page, so if I refresh the page, we're not getting a new image. We're getting the same image because it hasn't been 10 minutes since the last time which we actually fetched an image. Just to show that it's actually working, I'm going to go to the local storage and I'm going to clear everything. So local storage and then delete everything. Since there is no previous time, since there is no image, let's assume that the user is visiting this website for the first time. In that case, we have to make a request and get that image, right? So let's see if that's working. So if I refresh the page now, so we are getting a new image. Right now we have the image, we have the time as well. So now if I actually refresh the page again, so now if I refresh the page, it shouldn't be getting another image. It should use the image which is stored in the local storage. So if I refresh the page, we are not getting any new image. So that's exactly what we want. And back in the code, since we made everything as functions, it's also a good practice to move all of the code which we have in a global scope into a function. So I'm just going to cut everything and I'm going to create a new function called main, and I'm going to paste everything inside it, and after that I'm going to call the main function outside. Let's make sure that everything is working. So if I refresh the page, since it's not been 10 minutes since the last time which we fetched the wallpaper doesn't change, and the time is appropriate, the tasks are working. So yeah, everything is working. So yeah, that's the project. I hope that you learned a few things from this project, and if you did so, do like this video and do check out the other video which I made few weeks before. So that's it for this particular video. Bye.